You're listening to Good Morning Scotland with Gary Robertson and Gillian Marles. The time now is approaching 17 minutes past 8.
The BBC is under fire from the former Cabinet Minister, Lord Andrew Adonis, for its coverage of Brexit. He describes it as far too swayed towards the pro-Leave camp. Well, Lord Adonis is a leading Remain campaigner and has been outspoken on social media about what he sees as bias. The BBC says all of its journalists are subject to the BBC's editorial guidelines and impartiality requirements. Lord Andrew Adonis joins us now. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Leave won, so isn't it right that most of the focus is on them now?
There's an ongoing debate in the country about whether we should leave or not, for a very good reason, that until Parliament votes on the treaty to withdraw from the European Union, which won't be presented to Parliament until the end of this year, we have not, as a parliamentary democracy, taken a decision on whether or not to leave.
Well, the decision has been taken, hasn't it? The decision was taken in the referendum. The government is negotiating a leave position with the EU. The process is underway.
No, that's an assertion on the part of the BBC, which I'm afraid is a kind of cancer at the heart of our political debate at the moment, which is this view that the referendum 2 years ago meant that there is no further debate and no further decisions.
The debate is happening every single day. The debate is happening every single day. The problem is with
it's not being reported by the BBC, unfortunately. That's the big issue which I'm trying to get at.
Well, with respect, I mean, I was in Brussels just last week talking, or the week before, talking to politicians there. We were then in London talking to politicians with a year to go to the UK leaving the EU. I mean, ultimately, that vote in Parliament, the difficulty with all of this is that it's a meaningful vote, we're told, but we don't actually know whether it will stop the process or not, as you might wish.
Well, there were demonstrations in Edinburgh where you report from, or supposedly report from, 2 weeks ago. They weren't reported on the national BBC at all. Those were part of demonstrations that also took place in Leeds, in Newcastle, in cities up and down the country. They weren't reported. So I think the BBC has some very big questions to answer. Last month, Nigel Farage, who is the ex-leader of a party at 2% in the opinion polls, he made his 32nd appearance on BBC Question Time.
And Nigel Farage is one of the leading proponents of leave. Ultimately, the problem for the BBC when it comes to Question Time, surely, is that the other leave proponents are members of the Cabinet. And you will know, as a former Cabinet Minister, they don't appear on Question Time.
They do. There's a member of the Cabinet or a minister on Question Time.
A minister, but not a member of the Cabinet. And they were the other big figures in leave, weren't they?
Hold on, a minister is a member of the Cabinet. The policy of the government, this, I'm afraid, goes to the heart of the BBC and the defence you're trying to make of it. You're sounding like a partisan for the Leave campaign.
I'm just putting the opposite point of view to you.
No, what you're doing is you're putting the BBC's point of view, which I well understand, because the BBC now thinks that the debate is over and we should leave. But every time a minister appears on Question Time or on your programme, they're representing the case for leave, because that is the policy of the government.
Well, that's not strictly true in our programme, because in our programme we speak to the SNP regularly, because they're the government in Scotland, and they, of course, represent the Remain position.
Yeah, that's a silly debating point. I'm talking about the government in London. When I talk about the government, I mean that. There's a separate government in Scotland, and we know what that position is. But the government in London, its policy is to leave the European Union. So every time a minister appears, that is a representative of the quote-unquote Leave camp. Now, what the BBC Question Time and the BBC does is, on top of that, it thinks it should also have Mr Farage. Why? Because he has a very loud voice, he is very adept at manipulating the media, and he has big voices at the heart of the BBC. Now, I'm afraid, I'm a former minister, and until all this started, I think people thought of me as perfectly sensible and middle of the road. I think, having got into this, that the BBC has unfortunately stopped being an impartial state broadcaster and has essentially become a propagandist for leave.
Well, let me read
on the basis that it believes it's a done deal.
Let me read you what Lord Tebbit, the Conservative peer, says. He says the BBC is biased too. He says it's biased against Brexit. The BBC has become the supporter of a foreign organisation called the European Union. Isn't your problem here one that we hear regularly of those who claim bias? What you're actually arguing is that the BBC has allowed an opinion you don't agree with to be broadcast.
No, I don't think that's true at all. If you actually look at the BBC's coverage, it is systematically slanted in the direction of leave. And the BBC issued as editorial policy last week, which I'm told you're supposed to be observing, that the debate on whether to leave or not was now over. It was no longer a live political issue. The debate instead was on how we leave. Well, that isn't actually the British Constitution as it works. Parliament hasn't taken a decision on whether or not to leave. There are 63 million people in this country. Their whole future depends, and many of their jobs depend, on whether we stay in the European Union or not. I believe you, as a public broadcaster, have a duty to report this fairly and not to regard it as a done deal that we're leaving.
Thank you very much for speaking to us this morning. That's Lord Andrew Adonis. The time is 8.